Good morning, everybody. Oh, that's pretty loud. Good morning. Paula, Roland, and Sam are all on the faculty of the Stanley King Counseling Institute, which has been training independent school teachers in basic counseling and listening for over 50 years. Roland is the Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Harvard College. Paula worked in independent schools for a long time and now has a private psychotherapy practice in Dobbs Ferry, where she lives on the campus of the Master's School. Sam lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He is an emeritus professor of psychology at the Fielding Graduate University and is a prolific author. He blogs for Psychology Today. His most recent piece is entitled, How to Avoid a Personal Political Meltdown. Please welcome Roland, Paula, and Sam.
It's just me, actually. We're going to take turns. So in October of 1999, I stood on this stage at morning meeting and gave Taft's very first coming out speech. It was pretty scary, particularly for my son, who was a shy, Tafty sophomore, trembling in his seat, gay himself, and deep in the closet for another year or so after my talk. A lot has happened in our world since then, and I know Taft is a safer and more inclusive school than it was in 1999. Not that Taft was different from any other school. Coming out just 20 years ago was dicier than I imagine you imagine. And even today, things are less inclusive than you might think. If you enjoy straight privilege, white privilege, male privilege, all of which share a core of having the freedom to choose what you see and hear. If you enjoy any of those privileges, I challenge you, we challenge you today, to begin to notice what you do not always have to notice. A lot of that can happen when we learn to listen more closely to each other. Sam, Roland, and I are spending the day here working with you on listening, particularly across differences among us. So we're each going to speak briefly this morning about different aspects of something that we think of in overarching terms as wholeness. The three of us moonlight from our regular jobs to be teachers of teachers, mostly. Teachers of teachers from schools like Taft, training them in basic counseling and listening skills. And if you think real listening is easy, then you could probably benefit from some training too. We all can, really, because listening takes concentration, effort, and a lot of practice. It's not easy to focus on what someone is saying, feeling, and thinking over the din of the judgments that we are making, the ricochet of our own internal associations, the racket of our monkey minds, and the nearly irresistible temptation to take the conversational ball and run with it. I recently read and savored the term, the dog whistle of racism, a wonderful, spot-on expression that gets at the way in which some people don't hear anything at all, and some can't not hear its ear-splitting shriek. This too connects to deep listening, an effortful tuning in to each other's experience so that we can hear things our ears may not yet have been trained to hear. I assume, and I've heard from Sarah, that you've heard about times during the day when we'll be offering some conversation as well as training on listening skills, particularly as they apply to conversations across differences among and between us, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, etc. All of which are differences where we tend to have a more difficult time really listening because we are so full up with our own feelings and judgments and defenses. But I want to be clear that this is not a day about being gay, straight, white, black, Asian, Latinx, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or any of those other major identifiers that we have. It's really about the birthright of wholeness. Maya Angelou says, "There is no agony like bearing an untold story inside of you, feeling as though you have to hold in or cover your full story is a quiet agony. And helping to relieve people of that agony is a lot of what listening to each other within a safe school community is about. We're really only whole to the extent to which our story has been heard and understood by someone else. And I want to put this in the context of a framework. There's a psychological perspective, a framework called Gestalt psychology, which maintains basically in a nutshell that we go through life completing one task after another. We have a bent toward completing things. We really can't help it. Our brains need to do this. Could you give me the triangle? Thank you. The dots. So if you see these three dots, we form a triangle. We see it as a triangle even though they are entirely discrete dots. We see the relationship. We're wired to do that. And if I sing, happy birthday to you. Yeah, you see, so it takes a lot more energy not to finish that than it would to just take us all off the hook, as some of you did, thank you, and sing the last note. So we have this need to complete things. And the simplest physiological example of this concept is that there's probably at least one person in this auditorium who has to go to the bathroom pretty soon, right? And morning meeting was beginning, you can hold it, the bell was about to start, our bell was about to ding, and if you put off handling that task and keep putting it off, there's going to come a time when there's not much more you can think of other than that incomplete task. So according to Gestalt psychology, there's this cycle of awareness. It does always begin with awareness. So, I probably should have gone to the bathroom, or I'm going to have to soon, right? And then excitement, I really have to go. And then to live healthfully, action, I'm going to handle this, go to the bathroom, and then contact, where you actually do handle the task and complete it. But if you don't carry the cycle all the way through, there is increasingly, as we have all experienced, a portion of you that is distracted and unavailable for the tasks that you are handling, the other tasks, right? And the same principle operates in so many different contexts. It operates in terms of relational repair. If I feel like I probably should clean something up with somebody and I don't, or I need to have a conversation, I need to share something and I don't, it takes more energy to interrupt that cycle, and there's part of me that's unavailable. The same principle operates in terms of the gestalt, or the task of becoming all of who we are meant to be. And the same principle operates in terms of how a safe and loving community helps and is meant to evolve itself. Communities have their own gestalts, have their own evolution. As individuals, without feeling heard or understood, we drag unfinished emotional gestalts around with us, and they take energy. They are distracting. They are a slow leak, if you will, of that energy that would otherwise be available to us. Because we are hardwired to grow and to evolve. The 13th century poet Rumi, Sufi poet, wrote, "What was said to the rose to make it open was said to me here in my chest." What was said to the rose to make it open was said to me here in my chest. So we are wired to grow, and anything that interferes with this process is a blockage of that lifelong gestalt. It's not possible to bring your best attention to the task of your life and your work and all the tasks involved therein, including that lifelong task of growing, unless you are whole, unless you feel free to bring your whole self into the room. And ultimately, unless you get around to showing up as all of who you are, everything you do will be missing that potential energy, those pieces, that sense of wholeness. Are you with me? Oh, good, thank you. So when I feel free to be my whole self, it includes, among other things, being someone who processes more comfortably through the written word than the spoken word. Half Chinese, half white, Quaker, Taoist, kind of a science geek, driven by core values of curiosity, and kindness. Mother of 3, including a now 32-year-old gay son, Taft class of 2002. Mother of 3 who raised these children with my wife, Laura. So back when we were closeted, I was academic dean and she was dean of students at a school not too far from here. And that created quite a kerfuffle 25 years ago. A bunch of parents organized a boycott of the school's annual fund in protest of our employment. Rumors were unkind and painful, and it was really uncomfortable. But gradually, thanks in large part to a head of school who stood on principle, but gradually the whole thing became old news. And once that happened, I knew that an important gestalt had been completed, not just for the school, but also for me. So no longer was my attention distracted by, can I mention Laura in front of this person? Who's around who might overhear? Is it okay that our children, who are at that point quite small, say in front of students, Laura, can we finish the book tonight? Or should I teach them to conceal, as I actually did, I'm sorry to say, teach them to conceal who tucked them in at night? This kind of self-editing is hard on the soul, and many years later, we still very rarely feel safe enough to hold hands when we walk down the street. For most gay people, holding hands in public in most places is an act of effortful courage, a cue to be alert and a little bit anxious, not the comfort it's meant to be, not the comfort that it is our birthright to have. And there are countless other small aspects of straight privilege that are quietly powerful and meaningful and hard to be without. So within this framework of incomplete gestalts and not being able to feel whole, remember this, that sexual minorities are still the most frequent victims of hate crimes in our country, and most victims are too afraid to report the crime. Imagine bearing that untold story. Gay, lesbian, and trans youth continue to comprise 30% of all completed teen suicides. Now think of that in terms of unrealized potential, unfinished business, and interrupted gestalts. So our collective unfinished business around our differences hurts all of us. The U.S. Commission on Mental Health some years ago put out a report that said, the oppressive attitudes of Americans, which cause and perpetuate tension, are patently a most compelling health hazard. Their destructive effects severely cripple the growth and development of millions of our citizens, young and old alike. Now, here's the thing. This report is referring not to those who are oppressed, but to those who hold the oppressive beliefs. It stifles their growth and limits their contribution. Our collective potential is all bound up in this stuff, unable to help us complete the gestalt of being compassionately human, of living our true potential. Most of us don't think of ourselves as having oppressive beliefs, right? But when we deny phenomena such as various forms of privilege, those are oppressive beliefs. Can you hear the dog whistle? So the issue is much more than sexual orientation or identity, and what Roland, Sam, and I hope to do today is further the conversation at Taft about justice, principle, our shared humanity, love, and wholeness by helping you learn to listen. When we listen closely to someone, we are reminded that we are all just fellow travelers toward wholeness. Because really, once you put it out there, differences among us are only problematic when not given room, when not heard, understood, and accepted, only when the gestalt toward wholeness is interrupted. Now, some of you may think that we've completed what I'll call the diversity gestalt already. We already have an active GSA, Taft is plenty diverse, this is old hat, we're done with aha moments in terms of diversity, right? So we are never done with aha moments when it comes to really understanding each other. I ask you to use this assembly and the work of today to move yourself further along your own awareness cycle, because we all have a growing edge. Start wherever your growing edge is along this cycle, and remember that everything begins with awareness. Notice the dog whistle. And if you're not trying to do that in your relationships with others here at Taft or with anyone in your life, other people can actually detect it, they can smell it, because if you're not at your growing edge, you cannot authentically connect with the growing edge of other people. It gets in your way as a student or as a teacher, whether you're aware of it or not. So to move yourself along the awareness continuum with regard to straight privilege as the example of the moment, experiment now and then. Try not to come out as straight if you are straight. Avoid gender pronouns for a day. Notice what you notice. Notice your feelings. Notice that it takes energy. Something is being interrupted. It is an interruption of the gestalt, a disruption of your wholeness. And notice that that is the kind of self-editing that many, many people have to deal with in a variety of contexts, certainly not just sexual orientation, many contexts of their lives, because they are hearing a dog whistle and they're experiencing that pain. Figure out how to help with that with ever greater empathy. So here at Taft, what might a growing edge look like for you? How do you keep moving through awareness in dealing with this issue of wholeness, to excitement, to action, to contact, and on to the next gestalt with ever greater energy and wholeness and clarity? How do you listen closely enough to each other to help complete blocked gestalts so that together you can create a community at Taft where each person feels safe and whole, freely making the contribution that Taft needs and the world needs from you? If you can work toward that, and if you can bring that energy here into the rest of your life, then in important ways, we will together help our human family evolve toward the birthright of our collective wholeness. That is what diversity work is about. That's also what we're doing here, right? That's why we're alive, all of us, members of the raggedy, imperfect, troubled, amazing, evolving human family. And here I will pass it to Roland.
Good morning. Oh, God, are we awake? Good morning. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. So I want to talk a little bit about what some of these obstacles are that get in the way of being our whole selves, our complete selves, our most authentic selves. And you'll have to indulge me, and my colleague Sam is probably going to give me the hook if I go on too long, because I can be a bit of a storyteller. But I do want to share a couple of stories with you by way of example of what it is that we're talking about today. And the first one has to do with my son, Marcus. So Marcus is now 12 years old. This picture was taken a couple of years ago. Just, I don't know why I didn't update it, because I'm lazy. But anyhow, I would pick Marcus up from school, and the town that we live in is a suburb of Boston, which is a relatively affluent suburb. Actually, I shouldn't even say that. It's an affluent suburb. It's got a great deal of socioeconomic diversity, because on one end of it, there is sort of, what is the equivalent of Section 8 housing? What is that? Low-income housing? Low-income housing, thank you. And then on the other end is where Tom Brady and Gisele Bündchen live. So, and we're talking about a pretty broad spectrum of socioeconomic diversity. But Boston, a number of years ago, almost 40 years ago, decided that in an effort to help to desegregate the Boston public schools and to create more educational opportunity for students in Boston, they were going to bus students from Boston to some of these suburban schools. So Newton, where I live, anybody here from Newton, Massachusetts? What? Really? Oh, okay, hello, 2 people. Okay, good, thank you. So Newton is an interesting sort of mix of Newton students and Boston students in the public schools. And almost all of the students that come from Boston are Black and Latino. And Marcus, when he was in the 5th grade, I was picking him up from school, and I said, "Hey, buddy, how was your day?" And, he kind of grumbled a little bit, which was unusual for him. And I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, somebody said something stupid while we were at recess." And I said, "Well, what was that?" And he was telling me a story about one of his friends, one of his white Newton friends, who apparently had gotten into a bit of a tiff with one of the Black students from Boston. And so this kid was saying things like, those Black students. And Marcus, who has had a sense of both racial identity and a profound sense of social justice since the age of 2, got a little bent about that comment. And what he said to his friend was, "I'm Black, right?" And his friend said to him, "Well, you're not really Black." And by that, I guess he meant that because Marcus actually lived in Newton and didn't take the bus from Boston every day, that he was not the same as those kids from Boston. And rightly so, Marcus felt a particular way about that kind of a comment. And these kinds of comments are rather frequent for people who would be considered the other, whether you're a racial minority, a religious minority, a sexual minority. Hearing things like this happens all the time. And I am 47 years old, and I can't tell you how many of these kinds of comments I've heard throughout my life. And let me offer you just a few examples of the things that I've heard. "You're so articulate." Yeah, I should be, because I'm well educated. I pay attention to the world around me. I was a theater geek, so I learned how to project. So yes, I am very articulate, but the subtext of that is, well, what did you expect me to sound like? Where is this coming from? "You like classical music?" Yes, I do. It is actually my favorite music form. I was raised listening to classical music. I played trombone and sang all through middle school and high school and part of college. In fact, my 2 favorite music forms are classical music and hip hop. So thank you, Lin-Manuel Miranda, for creating Hamilton and mixing the 2 so that I can listen to that virtually every day. But again, this assumption here is that someone who looks like me wouldn't necessarily listen to classical music. Here's my favorite. "I thought all Black people could dance." Nope. Now, okay, let me be completely honest here and say, I can keep time, but when I'm compared to some friends of mine, I remember being in college and we were having, one of those stupid kind of dance battles, whatever. And I go into the circle, and my friend Ozzy is in there, and I just sort of waltzed in there. I was like doing the Running Man or something stupid. And he didn't even try to dance. He just literally doubled over in laughter and left the circle. And so, in comparison to some of my friends, I cannot dance. But again, this is the assumption. If you meet a Black person and they can't dance, then you think, well, maybe there's something wrong with this person. So these are all what have come to be known, I'll skip that one, as words and phrases that would fall into the category of unconscious bias. So we all have these stereotypes, these perceptions of one another, and they come out in some of these assumptions that I just referenced. They come from a variety of places. They're from our early life experiences. We get a lot of them from the news media, from other programs. I love the show Empire, but what a horrible, stereotypical depiction of Black women and some Black men. I'm almost embarrassed to say it publicly that I watched the show, but I will share with you something that I am really embarrassed to say that I've seen, and that is Tyler Perry's Medea. My kids made me go and watch Boo, a Medea Halloween last winter, and they are beyond excited at the fact that there is a second one coming out in October. Tyler Perry is not somebody that I ever wanted to watch any of his stuff, but I hate to admit that I saw it, and I hate to admit even more that when I saw it, I laughed my butt off. That stuff was funny. But again, horrible stereotypical depictions of black people in African American culture. So we get a lot of that from the mass media. We get a lot of these perceptions from our family and from our friends. They're pervasive, they're everywhere, and they're virtually unavoidable. Do you all know who Desmond Tutu is? Yes. Okay, good, thank God. We are not immune, none of us, from these unconscious biases. And I remember being particularly struck by this quote that I read from Desmond Tutu, where he was traveling from someplace to another, and he got on board the plane, and both pilots were black. And he said, the first thought that came to my mind was, hey, there are no white men in the cockpit. Are those blacks going to be able to make it? And here is one of the architects of the South African anti-apartheid movement, one of the preeminent social justice advocates in the world, in the history of humanity, and he harbors these unconscious biases towards black people. So what is the point of all of this? Well, the point is that unconscious biases lead to what are known as microaggressions. Now, a few years ago when I started talking about this stuff, nobody knew what microaggressions were. Do you all know what those are? Yeah. You have a sense of that? All right, so maybe I can skip some of these slides. But essentially, they're sort of commonplace statements, observations that might be injurious but aren't intended to be injurious, that someone would say things like, well, you're not really black, and don't mean to be offensive, but in reality, that kind of a comment is perceived as offensive. Some examples. So what does your hair look like today? She says as she pulled off my hat without my permission. So what do you guys speak in Japan? Asian? That one's just dumb. You're not really Asian. Oh, you don't speak Spanish? Like all people who identify as Hispanic or Latinx would speak Spanish. Not necessarily the case. You don't act like a normal black person, you know. No, where are you really from? So these are all examples of microaggressions, and I suspect if I polled the audience that we could probably come up with a number of microaggressions that have taken place here at Taft, probably just since the weekend. And we won't get into that, but I want you to be mindful if you either have experienced that on the receiving end or may have made a comment that you had thought about in retrospect might end up being a microaggression. So what does all this have to do with wholeness? How am I doing? Okay? All right. So microaggressions lead to a concept known as stereotype threat. And stereotype threat is this psychosocial phenomenon that was created, or not created, but observed by a psychologist by the name of Claude Steele. And essentially what Steele is saying is that the threat of stereotype threat is the threat of being viewed through the lens of a negative stereotype that's ascribed to your group. And either being viewed through that lens or by virtue of your actions inadvertently confirming the existence of that stereotype. So for example, there are a number of students that I've worked with over the years, black students, who when they're in the dining hall at their college, they refuse to eat watermelon in the dining hall. And the reason they don't want to do that is because watermelon is associated with African American culture in something of a stereotypical way. And they don't want to confirm that stereotype by eating watermelon in the dining hall in a public setting. Same holds true for fried chicken. Who doesn't like fried chicken? Vegetarians, I would imagine. But they might be the only people who don't like fried chicken. So what a shame it is that students feel as though they can't enjoy something, whether it's fried chicken or watermelon, or what have you, that would in some way confirm a stereotype about their group. And let's not kid ourselves. There are stereotypes that are applied to virtually every identity that is out there. black people have a number of stereotypes about appearance, about intellectual capabilities. Same with Latinos, Latinx people. I don't even need to touch on people who are transgender or maybe gay or lesbian. The stereotypes abound there. Women, regardless of their cultural identity or racial identity, have a number of stereotypes that apply to them. Let's take blondes, for example. How many blondes are there? Blonde girls in the audience, raise your hands. Yeah, any stereotypes about you guys? No? Yeah, I didn't think so. Men, white men. What would be a stereotype about white men, I wonder? Let's compare white male athletes on the basketball court to black male athletes on the basketball court. What is the stereotype there? What did you say? No, say it again, please. What was it? Oh, so they don't like drive to the net, they just got to do it from a distance, right? Okay. That is funny. I'm going to incorporate that the next time I speak. There was a study that was done where a group of all-white basketball players, male basketball players, were shown the movie White Men Can't Jump with Woody Harrelson and Wesley Snipes, thank you. And then after watching that movie, they were asked to play an all-black basketball team. How do you think they did? Not very well. So they fell victim to this notion of stereotype threat. So we are all subject to this in one way, shape, or form. And what it does is it inhibits our ability to bring our whole selves, this wholeness that Paula was talking about. If you can't enjoy a basketball game because you're falling victim to this notion of stereotypical athletic inferiority, or you can't eat a meal that you enjoy because you don't want to confirm a long-standing racial stereotype, then you are not being your whole self. So what can we do here at Taft? Well, first and foremost, you can learn about these issues, and that's part of why Paula, Sam, and I are here today. You can talk about them. And I would imagine and hope, dare say, expect that you will continue to talk about these things beyond today. We're hoping to just simply plant a seed, and we will be here for the day and continue to have these conversations in smaller groups. But beyond today, we hope that you will continue to talk about how these things might impact your life. And then when you see it or hear it, name it. If someone says something or does something and you can identify that as being stereotypical, as being a microaggression, then we sincerely hope that you will call your peers on it. And I don't want people to do this in a way that is confrontational. There is a gentle way of saying, hey man, that didn't sound right. Is that what you meant? That doesn't make someone feel bad about what they've done, because a lot of this is happening on an unconscious level. That's why it's called unconscious bias. But if you call somebody's awareness to it, then that allows that person to grow. And as Paula suggested, it pushes them along their growing edge. And that's what you can do to help each other. We are all learners, and we are all teachers. And I want you all to be in that position with one another around these issues, bringing it to each other's attention when you hear it, when you have moments like that occur. Don't let these things get in the way. You are a phenomenal community here at Taft. And the last thing that you should do is allow these things, these stereotypes, these incomplete gestalts to get in the way of your ability to exist as a community. So by all means, call each other on it, but don't lose sight of the fact that you are all here having this shared collective experience. Oops. I'm really struck by your motto, and I think that sort of sums up what it is that we expect that you all will take from today. And it's not in relation to the world outside of Taft, but it is in relation to the community that is Taft. So be of service to each other in this regard. That's my dog, Priscilla. So, Sam, I turn it over to you.
So, I'm the straight older white guy. How strange. Not a lot of them around here. And I want to talk to you a little bit in the 15 minutes that I have about being white in these fraught, intense political times here at Taft and elsewhere in our society. I think I'll begin by telling you that for a long time I was not white, at least to myself. I was Jewish. And Mishpracha, but don't get me started on that. Being white is actually not a homogeneous category. And if we get underneath the color of the skin, I think there's some really interesting stories to be told, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about mine. I grew up in a community that was anti-Semitic. So identifying as Jewish, and by the way, Jews generally don't identify with the oppressor. I mean, in the sense that we've been kicked around and out of so many countries through 2 millennia that we tend to actually see ourselves more as vulnerable and as part of the oppressed group, which is kind of some background for this story I want to tell you about. So I grew up in an anti-Semitic town in Westchester, interestingly, right outside New York City, not far from here, where Jews couldn't go to the public school. Now, there were no laws against this. This was in the 1950s, so it was right after World War II when redlining was still a very popular and common event in many towns. So the school I didn't go to was white, in my mind. The school district where I grew up, the town I grew up in, was different from the town limits. So Jews and blacks couldn't buy houses in the school district. They were subtly steered to the outskirts of the town. So when my parents were looking at a kind of nice house close to the center of town, they were told, my mother recounted to me years later, by the real estate agent, oh, you wouldn't want to live there, but we have some lovely houses on the edge of town. And that's actually where they bought a house in the early 1950s. So I grew up in an informal, unstated Jewish Italian ghetto. And I went to a polyglot school of blacks, Jews, and Italians, which is really, really pretty cool. The best I can figure it, my high school was the different school, and the lovely ivy-covered school in the center of town that looked kind of like Harvard South was the white school. So for a long time in my own life, during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, I figured I got what black people were going through in the civil rights movement. I kind of saw an equivalence between being Jewish and being black in my own mind. Ghetto, in fact, is a word derived from the Jewish experience in Rome. And what's the town on the edge of Italy with, you know? On the edge of Italy? Yeah. It'll come to you in the middle of the talk and I'll blurt it out. But the ghetto is a word derived from the Jewish experience in Rome, where the Jews were confined to a small district by the Pope and Italian authorities in medieval times. And in fact, Martin Luther King had a very strong relationship with the Jews. Stanley Levinson was a Jewish financier who raised lots of money for Martin Luther King and actually helped him write some of his speeches. And J. Edgar Hoover, the former head of the FBI, labeled Stanley Levinson that commie Jew in the FBI files, which I took to be a term of respect, and that's pretty cool. I like that. And when you take a look at the original pictures from the wonderful and poignant march in Selma, right next to King is a rabbi, Rabbi Heschel, who is a Reconstructionist rabbi who really kind of gave new life to contemporary Judaism, and he was very influential in Martin Luther King's thinking. So when they locked arms, everybody, there's Heschel with his long beard and his yarmulke and all that stuff. And he said to Martin, Martin, pointing to his feet when they began the march, said, Martin, here's my Judaism, pointing to his feet, that Jews are active out in the world. Social justice is what you do, not what you say. And that had a big impact on me. This has changed over the years. When you consider the movie Selma now, how many of you have seen the movie Selma? Not a lot. Well, when you do see it, and I recommend you do, you will see that in that scene, the famous scene at the Pettus Bridge, when they're starting the march, there's no rabbi in the scene anymore. He's been taken out. So the Jewish-black bond is somewhat frayed currently. But that might be rekindled in light of Charlottesville, when Jews and blacks were both targeted. But leaving that aside, I've had to rethink a lot for myself about what it means to be white, what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be black. It started with the events of the past several years, the eruption of protest after Ferguson, Trayvon Martin in Florida. I began to read things that really impacted me. One thing I read was from an account by an emergency room surgeon in Dallas. He's the head of the ER in Dallas. You may remember a few years ago there was a terrible set of shootings by a sniper in which several black cops were shot. The emergency room surgeon was writing about trying as best he could to save the lives of these black men while his hands were shaking. Oh, sorry, these are white cops. Sorry, white cops. The surgeon was recounting his hands were shaking as he was trying to do surgery on these policemen because he was black. And all of his life he had been terrified of the police. Then where I live in Cambridge, you may remember back when Obama was, right after his inauguration, a Harvard professor who was black was arrested on the porch of his house for trying to get into his home when he didn't have the keys. And someone called the police and said, a black man's trying to break into a house here. And there was a whole big brouhaha about that. Then I read Senator Tim Scott, who is a senator from South Carolina and is black, who talked about being stopped walking into the Senate office building, despite wearing a badge saying he's a senator, by the guards, and what it was like to be a black man who is a U.S. senator and still has no protection from the authorities. And finally, in Cambridge, there was an experience that really kind of touched me a lot, which was on the subway, the MBTA, a woman was riding from Cambridge down to Park Street in Boston on the subway, and she was in a subway car, and a black kid came in after school, Cambridge Rindge and Latin kid, going downtown. And in the course of the subway ride, a whole bunch of other black kids came in and started raising a ruckus on the subway car. So someone called the police, and when they got to Park Street, the police were waiting, and the police went into the car, and they turned to all the black kids and said, get out of the car, including this lone black student from school who had been sitting next to this woman. Nobody did anything except this woman who was a student at Emerson. She got out of the car and she said to the police, that boy was not doing anything. And the cop said, no, get back in the car, we'll take care of this. And the woman said, no, I'm not getting back in the car until you allow this boy to get back in the car too. He was doing nothing. And they eventually let the kid get back in the car, and she took him back to his mother, actually. And I read that and I thought, would I have done that? Would I have gotten out of the car and confronted the police? I don't know if I would have. And finally, this is just in. Some of you may have read LeBron James's tweet about our president. This is not about LeBron James. LeBron James is a power forward point guard for the Cleveland Cavaliers. And he tweeted something about our current president. And after that tweet, the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, Dan Gilbert, went on the news and said, quote, "I received voicemails after LeBron tweeted that were some of the most vile, disgusting, racist messages," Gilbert said. "There's an element of racism that I didn't even realize existed in this country this much." And I thought to myself, well, that was me a year ago. And you could ask LeBron, he would have told you, because his house was spray painted with racist slurs a couple of months ago in Los Angeles. So I've been thinking a lot as a white person about how I learned that I am white and how the experience of color came into my life. The recognition that I was living in a world of color, not just a white world. And I've been thinking a lot about the living with false equivalences, making the assumption that my experience is similar to other people's. In this case, black people. It could be Hispanic people, it could be any of us. Making the assumption that I know something about what the other person is experiencing. I'm nervous around cops. There may be a genetic fear of authorities in the Jewish gene, I don't know. But when I'm hassled, I know that I can just go and complain to the chief of police because I'm white. I mean, I might get upset, but I'll just tell your boss what you're doing here. And I'd like to invite each of the white folk, my brethren, here in this room, to consider for a moment the earliest time you became aware of being white, in contrast to others who are not white. Take a minute, seriously, take a minute and think back to the first time you realized you were white. Okay. I'd like to tell you about mine because the first time someone said, this is an exercise from a very interesting book called Learning to be White by Van Decke, a really interesting journalist and scholar. And the first time when I read this in the book, she said, you know, white people, think about the first time you realized you were white. I said, come on, give me a break. And about 2 days later, I remembered when it was. I said, oh, wow. So I was about 5. And I lived on the west side of Manhattan for a while as a kid. And I was walking with my grandmother. And I must have been after school, and she had picked me up. She was a great lady. I love my grandmother, by the way, in this story, despite what happens. She was the first woman admitted to the New York State Bar as a lawyer, one of the first in the early 1900s. She was a smart and clever woman and very compassionate. However, on this day, I was walking with her, and I was holding her hand, walking down Broadway, and there was a black kid standing on a street corner next to a box, and I think he was selling newspapers, or maybe even better, soda and candies. I can't remember what. But anyway, I looked at him, and I thought, wow. And I went over to him in some impulse of kind of this. And my grandmother pulled my hand and pulled me back and said, no, don't go there. And I don't know what she meant. Maybe she was worried I'd run into the street. Maybe she didn't want to buy me candy or a newspaper. But I internalized that as the kid was something of color, something about him. And there was a great sadness in this memory for me, actually, when I remembered it a couple of months ago. Great sense of separation, that I was somehow different from that. So we can talk more about that. In the course of the day, if any of you want to talk about any of this, as Roland and Paula have said, there'll be plenty of opportunity. But I do want to underscore for you the trap of equivalence, assuming that you understand another person's experience. We all do it. We all have categories in our heads, and we sort what we see and hear into those categories. Paula talked about Gestalt theory. In addition, there's a really interesting developing theory in psychology called mentalization, how people come to know about the world It's the study of how we actually know anything. Because when you think about it, the world does not exist in pure perceptual form. That triangle, those 3 dots that Paula put up there, is a little microcosm of how we construct the world. We don't see necessarily 3 separate entities. We see a triangle. We want to put things into pre-existing categories. So we have a kind of active construction that goes on. And one of the famous sayings that comes out of mentalization theory is, quote, "Our mind is not the world." But we think it is. We think our mind knows the world. Yet it turns out it's really difficult to know what another person is feeling and experiencing. We make assumptions and how to be aware so that we can really hear the other person. How do we get over this kind of empathy wall? All this talk about walls, it's the empathy wall that's the big problem, and how to bring it down, that separates us from other people. There was an email exchange, this in closing, I just want to tell you about this email exchange in Cambridge on one of our, Cambridge has a lot of these like next door apps where you can talk to your neighbors about issues. So somebody, believe it or not, put a Confederate flag out. You can imagine in Cambridge, Massachusetts, this really made a lot was going on about this. So there was a whole email thread about this Confederate flag, trying to talk to the people who put out the flag. Why'd they do this? Oh my gosh, you know, really very heartfelt stuff, which then began to degenerate. Until finally someone posted, "The person who put this Confederate flag out is not a human being. I don't want to talk to her at all." And I thought, uh-oh. Now we got real problems. When people become not human, bugs, insects, vermin are often the more extreme versions. We're in deep trouble. And we live in a world that polarizes people. It's the nature of social media, and 140 characters is not enough to really get to know someone else. So here at Taft, what I would hope is, in the course of today and as we move forward, people will take some risks in what they're willing to talk about with each other. And it's not easy because you have to be willing to make mistakes. The big fear, as Roland was saying, you know, do it, put it out there. The big fear is I'm going to look racist, or I'm going to look like an idiot. And the truth is, sometimes you might. But pushing that edge means taking those risks. Be forgiving, because we're all trying to learn a new language and a new vocabulary here and a new way of talking to each other. Taking risks on the one hand, being forgiving on the other. Listen and talk. And thank you all for inviting us here today. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I really look forward to it as a chance for us all to learn something new about ourselves and other people. Thank you.